If you happen to be active on social media, we would love for you to join us. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we have a couple of Twitter accounts, mine and one for the Chamber. We'd encourage you to do that. If you are posting on social media today, I'd encourage you to use the hashtag ILM Scorecard. I'll be using that hashtag, and you can follow along at that scorecard. I'd like to also now thank in attendance our elected officials and representatives of the county and the city who are with us, and our other partner organizations, WBD, WDI, the Tourism Development Authority, and other organizations that we work with. We have a great committee. And so to that end, I'd like to introduce to you now the chair of our committee this year, Jason Wheeler with Pathfinder Consulting, and then our infamous economist from UNC Wilmington, Adam Jones. Thank you, guys.
Good morning, everyone. Well, first, thanks for being here. This is something that's come about in a few years. I think our first scorecard was in 2015. So this is our third scorecard. I'd personally like to thank Hal Kitchen. Is Hal out there somewhere? I'm not sure if you could hear it. I don't know where Hal is. In the back? Oh, there he is. Give me the eagle eye, make sure I don't screw up. Okay. Is that better? It's not on.
Flip the switch.
How about now? Thank you. Well, at least you could hear me back there. I first wanted to give a little background about the scorecard. So as I mentioned, it was November 2015 when the scorecard was first unveiled. It sort of comes from a little history about our community. As many of you know, we are a real estate development heavy community. And in 2007, 8, and 9, we suffered, along with most of the other country, in a pretty significant recession. Coming out of that, we took a look at our community and said, okay, how are we going to not be so focused on one sector for our recovery? And we were lagging in our recovery. And so a lot of effort went into things such as developing the ability to get the Garner report, which was the Pathways to Prosperity. And then the Chamber decided that we needed to look at how we can measure ourselves in our recovery and specifically look at some of the different areas that we can control. And so the first thing I'll mention is that the scorecard itself is a means of a conversation. It is not a marketing piece. Hal made sure that he reinforced that very much. And I think that that's a good thing for us to know, because today we're going to change it a little bit. Hal, and as the chair, Scott, where is Scott? Cheklevsky is basically the glue that holds all of this together, and Dr. Jones here is the data guy. And so the three of them basically spearheaded this for the last 2 years. When Hal and Natalie approached me and said, will you help chair this? I said, yes, but I'm going to need more help because you guys are all doing this better than I can. So what we did is we decided to form a committee structure this year. And if you turn to the back of the economic scorecard, you can see in the top left who the committee members are. And I'd first like to give them a round of applause for being a part of the committee. As you can see, this group is from the city, from the county. They are also from the private sector. And it was fantastic the first time we saw this data to watch that group really have in-depth conversation. And so what we decided was this year we were going to have that happen here at the scorecard unveiling. And so I'll mention some instructions in just a little bit, but we are very much looking forward to your input. So the data itself that comes through this scorecard is objective data. There are a lot of ways that we can measure a lot of things in our community, and I'm sure you would all offer a few additional points to analyze and data to look at. But I can tell you that it's difficult to get this data, and thanks to Dr. Jones, he's able to do that. Some of this data is 2 years old. Most of it is at least 1 year old because it takes that long to compile this data. And so I'd like to let you know, first of all, that this is data that is exactly the same way collected in our community that it is in what I'll show you in just a second, the comparable cities. Next, we want to look at this scorecard as it relates to that set of locations that are comparable to us. And then we want to use this to have a discussion, both in the private sector and also in the public sector, to discuss policy and the things that we want to happen in our see happen in our community. So the main takeaways here to look for the trends that happen over time. This is not one set of data for 1 year. It takes a snapshot for the latest data, but it also looks at trends over the longer term, which you'll see if you've seen this scorecard before. And it helps us identify some opportunities. And that's what we're hoping to capture today, is to look for some opportunities. So if you'll flip over to the peer cities, you can see what were considered our comparable cities or our peer cities that we study. And those are the top 7. You can also see underneath there are 2 aspirational cities that will also show up in our scorecard as well. I think it's important to consider both who these cities are, what their strengths are, and what their weaknesses are, and then think about how they're relative to us. And a lot of work went into deciding these cities. I'm not going to go into that today. There's a little bit of information in the scorecard. The aspirational cities, I think everybody in here would say, those are 2 great cities, and we love those cities. I just actually flew back from Nashville last night. That's quite a tremendous economic development in that city as well, too. So when you think about aspirational cities, these are things that we can look for opportunities, maybe that's already existing in those communities that we could bring back to ours. So thinking about economic prosperity, the model is basically 3 levels of a pyramid, and you've seen this, it's in the scorecard. The first is what we are trying to capture the most, which are what are the impacts for economic prosperity. And when you see the bottom, you can see human capital, you can see the innovative activity, the entrepreneurial environment, and also our quality of place. Likewise, those will also be pages within the scorecard that those are the indexes that we're measuring. So yes, we're going to look at the economic output at the end, but we first want to see what inputs are we creating. And this is really the area we want to measure our progress and look for opportunities. The next level of economic prosperity, as you can see, maybe you can see those, industrial composition, our physical infrastructure. You've got social, cultural, and institutional environment. And we could also talk about a lot of ways that we can measure how we compare against those other cities as well. This scorecard does not have as much data on that. We need to start with a basis, and we wanted to look really at the inputs. What can we do? The next level, and the top of the pyramid, are the outcomes. So we want to see what is our economic output? What is our employment? What are earnings and income? And you can see that in the scorecard as well. We do have a page on our economic output relative to our peer cities and our aspirational cities as well. So overall, this is the basis in which we formed the scorecard. And I want to just highlight a few takeaways, and then we're going to turn it over to Dr. Jones, who's going to go through the data. So first, some of our key takeaways. By the way, I would just mention, the idea with objective data is that you see the good and the bad, correct? And so we looked at good and bad, and we would hope that would spark conversation. So the first area that I'd highlight is employment. We lost ground in knowledge workers. Thinking about knowledge workers, Cape Fear Future, which I believe Mitch Lamb's going to speak at the end, which is basically the group that put this together. I was inspired by that group. They talked about the idea of having knowledge workers in our community, science, technology, areas of basically higher wages and help for growth and prosperity. So yes, we do have a loss in that, relatively speaking. And I would just mention a couple of things. In a small community, we can be sensitive, right? So we can be sensitive to different employers and things like that. So you've got to take it on a relative basis, but this is an area that we're not extremely excited about. Growth in lower paying sectors, though, although it's lower paying sectors, we do see growth in that area. So again, this is a highlight, something that we can say, okay, well, that's good. We are able to bring that up, which is part of economic recovery and economic growth. The next area is on our pay growth. So as you can see that as well, average pay growth was the slowest of our peers. And my staff is here, so hopefully they won't bring that back to me when we get to the office. Some of that has to do with new development and obviously the business community here, but that does take into account all of our wages, both public, private sector. The next area, entrepreneurship, and you can see that we are a region of small businesses, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone here. So, and you'll see specifically on the entrepreneur activity page how we highlight how we compare with the amount of small businesses, and also the length of time that we have our small businesses. And again, turning that over to you to have a discussion of the pros and cons and what are the opportunities there. The next area you'll see is the traded sector. Remain relatively flat. This is an area we have lagged in. Talk a little bit about the traded sector. I think this is probably a little more important than some folks may think about what it is. What the traded sector is basically bringing other people's dollars into our community. All right, that's the easiest way that I can explain that to you. So if we have a business that sells all over the country, then we are bringing all those dollars from all those other communities to the Wilmington and New Hanover region. And so I think it's important that we look at that as a key indicator as well. And this is something that both public and private sector can collaborate and try to see where opportunities can be to improve this. And then finally, and not a big surprise to anybody in this room, is the quality of place. Significant improvements in our crime rates. So that's fantastic to both our police force and the folks who have been behind those efforts. A lot of things have gone in the community to make improvements in that area. And then also we've moved up 2 spots on our index. And so this is an area where I don't think anybody is surprised that we have a fantastic place to live, and it keeps getting better. So those are the key takeaways. What we're going to do this morning, and so thinking about what the objectives are of the scorecard, rather than just be inundated with fun economic facts from a economist, we're going to try to recognize our progress in these areas. And you can see.
Thanks for setting that up.
Yeah, gotcha. Recognizing our progress in this area, and then we're going to actually turn it over to you. So we want to look for some areas of opportunity as well, too. So this is a community effort. So one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning was how the committee really started engaging in conversation, and all these different groups that were representative in our committee. It was a fantastic meeting. I think people were going out well after the meeting was over because the conversation was so engaging. So what we've got in your packet in front of you, and you'll see the colored folders on each table. There are different color folders, and Dr. Jones will speak to those. We're going to get together in groups of 2 or 3 at your table. So we're going to go through one of these indicators. Dr. Jones is going to present the data. Then we're going to turn it over to the table to fill out, and you'll see that there's a strength and weakness in these different areas. And we want your opinion. And then at the end, there's just one question that you'd fill out, talking about what's an area of opportunity for us. So we're going to compile this data, and we're going to be able to make this available to everyone. So we hope that today's conversations at the tables are as good as ours in the committee, and ask for that input. So he'll turn that over. Because of the time, we're going to have about somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes per section, so you have to get going once we get you going. And then if we have time at the end, we'll turn it over for questions as well. So again, please look at those. Please give us your input, and we're going to make that data available to you in a very short period of time. So with that, thank you all for being here again, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Well, I guess I should start by apologizing for the fact that you're hearing my name. I think that that's does a real disservice to the committee. The reason you're hearing my name is because I said, who's going to talk about statistics at 8 o'clock in the morning? And I said, Jones, you're up. So now, personally, I'm excited about this. So usually I'm putting my students to sleep at 8 o'clock in the morning with economics. You all are a challenge for me because you're engaged and paying attention, right? So we'll see if I can put you to sleep too. All right, so before we get into each of the indicators, we need to talk about just what do these numbers mean. So we're going to think a little bit about how to interpret the numbers before we actually get into them. So a question that we find ourselves asking a lot when we see a number is that good? So this became real clear to me a couple weeks ago when I was talking with my brother, and he has kids, bragging about his kids like most people do. And he was telling me about the fact that his son was 5 feet tall at age 10. And I'm like, so? Is that good? Is that tall? It wasn't until he told me, oh, that's like the 90th percentile for kids, that, okay, now I have some context to understand this. Good, so clearly I don't have kids, right, so I need some context around it. Well, most of you are probably not digging through BLS and BEA data on a regular basis. So the committee has set up this scorecard to try and put context in it such that we can easily understand where we stand. All right, so how do we do that? The way it's done is the data is set up as an index. So an index takes our value and scales it. So think about it this way. Like I said, with maybe my nephew's a good example, right? If he's 5 feet tall, how does that compare to other kids? Well, if we take his height and divide it by the average of all children, then, if it's greater than 1, then clearly he's taller. If it's less than 1, he's below average. All right, so now the problem with just taking a number and dividing it by an average is you're left with decimals. None of us like decimals, especially at 8 o'clock in the morning. So we multiply this ratio by 100 just to clean up the decimal problem. So that leaves us with a nice, clean interpretation. All right, so essentially what we're doing is we're picking a value that we're interested in, we're scaling it for the size of the community, and then we're comparing it to a baseline reference, the national value for that ratio, which gives us an easy interpretation of looking at these numbers of if it's greater than 100, we're performing above the national average, and if it's less than 100, we're below the national average. So a value of 110 means we're 10% better than the national average. So as we go through and you see some of these numbers and you go, what does 110 mean? Right, that means we're better than national. So all of these compare them to 100. All right, so thinking about this data over time, one of the objectives of this project was to evaluate ourselves every year and consistently. So as we've gone through, after every one of these morning meetings, there's lots of discussion about, are these the right statistics, and could we possibly use another set? And the answer to that when we're talking about data is always, yes, right? We could use something else. But is that really being fair? Is it really achieving the objective if we change the metric every year? There's value from consistency. So are these perfect? No. Is there any perfect statistic? No. But there's a lot of value in consistency over time. So the indicators we're going to see this morning are the same ones from last year, the same from the year before. There's value in using these same ones. On the breakout pages, those pages all have different stories each year as we try and highlight and fill in context of what's going on. So as Jason talked about a minute ago, the scorecard uses the most recent data. Our version of recent and the federal government's version of recent may be slightly different. Some of this data is lagged. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the data that they put out. Some of the data is preliminary, which means it gets revised. So it's sort of a moving target every year. So what we've done is when we produce the scorecard, we say, how are we doing this year? How did we do last year? And then how did we do in a base year of 2010? Each year when we release the scorecard, we go through and we recalculate last year and 2010 based on the revised data. So if you look at it and say, well, why is this number a little bit different than it was in last year's scorecard? The answer is because the feds are changing the numbers as more data comes in, and with the value of hindsight, they're able to update their data. So we're trying to use the most accurate data as we can, as well as the most timely. All right, more issues when we're thinking about data, and that's thinking about, well, what area do we even want to look at data for? So I tell people when they ask me, where'd you grow up? I say, well, I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in Houston. But I never actually had a Chicago address, and I never actually had a Houston address. They were River Forest and Katy. But why do I tell people that? Because I cheered for the Chicago Bulls. I cheered for the Houston Rockets. Cheered for the Green Bay Packers, but that's another story. So let's think about our region. What is Wilmington? Where is Wilmington? I bet a bunch of you have a Wilmington address and don't even live in the city limits. So what region are we really talking about? So there's a difference between what you might call a political jurisdiction and a functional region. We're interested in the functional region. What would we, as just citizens, consider Wilmington? So the way the federal government thinks about these functional regions is what they call metropolitan statistical areas. So an MSA, for short, is made up of counties that the federal government thinks function together. So they think if you ask people in the counties within an MSA, where are you from? The people in the Chicago MSA are going to say Chicago. The people in the Atlanta MSA are going to say Atlanta. So that, I mean, a little more technical than that, but you can think about it that way. So what is the Wilmington MSA? What is our functional area as they define it for statistical purposes? Well, it used to be New Hanover County, Pender County, and Brunswick County. And then a few years ago, the federal government thought, oh, well, people in Brunswick County are starting to say they're from Myrtle. They took Brunswick County and they put it into the Myrtle Beach metropolitan area. I'm not sure that makes sense. The committee's not sure that makes sense. The folks that are living over in Leland are flying out of Wilmington International Airport. Or at least Julie Wilsey says they better be. So as we think about the world, we think about it from a functional region perspective. We said from trying to analyze the Wilmington area, we want to make Brunswick part of Wilmington again. So we've done the best where we can to add Brunswick County back into what we call the Wilmington region. We can't always do that. Excuse me, some data is released at the MSA level, some data is released at the county level, but we've done our best where we can to try and incorporate Brunswick in our area. All right, a little bit of context and then we'll get to the numbers. So the first, I guess, point we should make is that these numbers are slow to evolve. They don't often change much from one year to another. When they do change, there are two reasons they could change. Some of it could actually be an underlying change in the economic activity, or it could just be a change in measurement. It could be measurement error. When you start drilling down on these smaller areas like a county, the federal government is not calling and surveying every one of you to ask how many hours did you work last month, how much did you get paid, how many employees do you have. They're using algorithms to try and come up with estimates of this. So when we look at this, if there's a small change in an index of a point or two, that could easily be just a change in the estimation process or what we might call noise, as opposed to an underlying change. So what we're really trying to look at and find is where are the big changes? Where can we identify what's really changing within our regional economy? All right, so I would advise you to look at the data, compare it to last year, compare it to the 2010 baseline, and then take that and compare it to your experience. We said there's no such thing as a perfect statistic. Think about, does this jive with what I'm seeing in the world? And if it doesn't, then try and figure out why. Think about, is it an issue of what you're able to see from your vantage point, right? Who we interact with, maybe we're not seeing the entire story, or is there potentially a problem in the statistic? Don't necessarily say, that doesn't match what I think, I'm going to dismiss it. Give it some thought. Our goal here is to really think about this and have a conversation about what's going on. All right, enough statistics. You all asleep? I don't see any heads down, which means you're doing better than 50% of my class would be. Let's get into the indices. So we have 4 indices in the base of the pyramid and the traded sector. We're going to sort of group these up, and we're going to talk first about human capital and the innovative activity index, and then we're going to turn it over to you. So let's get rolling with it. So innovation and human capital is really a story about us, right? It's a story about our people, a story about our residents. So when we were looking at this, sometimes even before you build the indices, trends start to become apparent. And as we were looking at employment by sector and just scrolling through from one year to another, the committee was surprised at how much movement there was within the sectors. All right, so if you're looking, you're like, wait a minute, which page is this on? We've reordered this a little bit for the presentation. This is actually near the end of your scorecard, but I think it fits in here in terms of thinking about where the regional economy is going. So if we look at it, we can see very clearly that the emphasis within the region has changed. So to a large extent, this mirrors national trends as we move towards a more service-based economy, but it's been a more dramatic shift in the Wilmington area. So we've seen former leaders in the traded sector like upstream chemical products drop out of the top 10. So not to kill you with statistics this morning, but upstream chemical employment is roughly 1/10 of what it was in 1998. Other ones that are on there, vulcanized products is now less than half of what it was. Aerospace and defense, less than half of what it was. And we've seen some declines in employment in those sectors, but shifts towards other sectors. So business and professional services has more than doubled across that time. Hospitality and tourism, more than doubled. We've seen a dramatic change in where folks are employed. Now, whether or not that's a good thing is a value judgment and where we want the community to be involved. The objective of the scorecard is to put the numbers out, point at some of these things, and then let the community decide on its direction.
And I'd just jump in there as well, too. This is where I mentioned the sensitivity to one or two employers in our community. So if you've got an employer who leaves our area, then this can change the data quite dramatically. And so just again, thinking about what this is, again, we've heard this discussion about, do we need more manufacturing type facilities in here? What are we doing in our 421 corridor? Things like that, and a lot of this is seen in this data.
So as we go through, thinking about these shifts, the reason we put this up here is we want to sort of put all of this in context. So if we look back and we say, how are we doing today compared to 2010, we have to hop in the Wayback Machine and try and remember what 2010 was like. 2010 was where the U.S. economy was starting to come out of the recession. Wilmington was still in recession. So the way I sort of think about this in my mind is that the regional economy is a lot like a road trip. It's a journey with no end almost. And as we go through it, sometimes we're going to find we're on a different road. The question is, do we like this new road we're on? Do we stay on it, or do we plot a path back to the old one? So as we talk about changes in these numbers, if something goes down, don't necessarily take that as, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, we've failed. Realize that this is a story about an evolution and a change in the economy over time, and we should be having this conversation about, do we like this road on a regular basis? That's our point. All right, so getting into it, if we look at the Innovative Activity Index first, we see reasons to be proud of ourselves, and we see some opportunities. So if we look at the change from last year and even versus 2010, we see that we've lost some ground. So that's where there are opportunities. But I think there's also reason to be proud of ourselves as well. So we may have lost a little bit of ground, but we still do very well compared to our peers. So this is not a story about, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. That's not it at all. This is a story about the economy changing as we come out of the recession and employment trends changing. So let's look at what's driving this, this decrease in this index over the last year or last 6 years. And the big driver is change in employment composition. We're going to see this again in a second in the next one. So the big driver here is a change in technical employment. And all of these are relative to our peers, but if you dive into the data, we've not only lost ground in a relative sense, we've lost knowledge jobs, we've lost technical jobs. So coming out of the recession, we saw growth in those jobs. Things were moving along, and then about 3 years ago, it flipped around, and we started to lose knowledge workers. this is where there's an opportunity for us to make some improvements. All right, other ones up here to look at. So one of the problems with some of the data, especially in this indicator, is that it is kind of noisy. There's a lot of variance in it. If you look at, say, the patent index, if we have 60 patents in a year in New Hanover County, that's a heck of a year for us. If we have 30, that's a down year. That's not a whole lot of variance between really good and really bad. So these are highly variable data points, excuse me, in that index. So it moves around a little bit. The one that sort of jumps off the page at me, though, is this change in employment composition. And that shows up again in the next index. So the human capital index. The human capital index is aimed at trying to measure the talents and abilities of our workforce. So how well trained are they? How much experience do they have? And are we using those talents? So on the human capital index, we're down a little bit from 2010 and a little bit from last year, mostly driven by this change in employment composition. So if we look at the pieces that make up this index, it's the same story showing up again. This is being driven by a change in knowledge workers. Knowledge workers includes those technical workers. So as we lose the technical, the really high-skilled employment, that shows up in both of these indices. When we look at high school graduates and college graduates, we're very close to the national average on that, and the employment rate, we're close to the national average as well. I think there'll be improvement in this index from the employment rate perspective over the next year or two. As our recovery has lagged the national, it's now getting rolling, so we think this will probably upswing there, but not so optimistic about the knowledge workers and the technical workers. We think we have a gap or an opportunity. All right, so we've been talking about ourselves with human capital and innovation. We're going to move a little bit broader now, and we're going to think about our businesses. So we're going to think about entrepreneurship and the traded sector. So if you look around Wilmington, as most of you do, you think about all the small businesses we have. We have a question of, all right, we have lots of small businesses. Are they growing to be large businesses, or are they just sort of churning? What's going on? And unfortunately, we don't have what economists call panel data, meaning data that follows each individual firm from one year to the next. I've put in a request for data that follows every single one of you and all your spending habits. The NSA turned me down. They said they're keeping that to themselves. So if we don't have exactly what we're looking for, is there another way to try and identify and get at some of these issues? So we thought, well, let's just see how old are the firms in the region on average and compare that to our peer cities. So if we look at the average age of firms in the region, we see that we're a relatively youthful group of companies. So this means there's lots of potential there. Lots of potential for these firms to grow over time and to gain experience. And if we look at how we're doing in terms of size of companies compared to the national average, we see we're doing okay on the small companies. We're a little bit heavier on this sort of 5 to 10 employee range, right? So the ones that have gotten off the ground. The question is, what's holding them back from taking the next step? What's keeping them from growing into becoming the large companies? So it could be a bunch of different things, right? It could be policy, it could be resources, it could be employee availability, and it could just be the preferences of the business owners. Look, I'm an academic. I enjoy being able to work with myself and essentially only myself, right? So it may not be that everybody's objective is to run a Fortune 500 company. So we want to look for where are the firms that have the right set of preferences and the right entrepreneurial attitude such that we can bring resources to them and help them grow. All right, so getting into our indices, how are we doing on that? On the entrepreneurial index, we score relatively well here. We've lost 2 points, but again, I think that's noise in the data more than anything else. Roughly the same spot we were last year. So doing well compared to our peer cities, definitely have folks in the community who are willing to take on these ventures. And this shows up real clearly with the number of small businesses we have and the number of firms. Again, there's some variation here. I think that's well within the noise of the data. Where we've seen some gains recently is in the proprietor's income share. So I think that this is a very promising sign going forward. So proprietor's income share is taking the income that goes to a proprietor, the owner of a business, and dividing by total income for the region. So what's causing this to go up? Well, it could be that there are more profits in the companies and now owners are doing better, or it could also be that there are more businesses and a larger share of our income is counted as proprietor income instead of wage income. Either way, I think this is a positive sign that we see the folks that are risk takers and entrepreneurial having more income and capital in their pockets, which bodes well for the future. So I think this is one that we can be excited about. That being said, there are still some challenges here as well on the business services side. We lack a little bit in terms of our ratio of businesses that provide services to other businesses compared to our peer cities. So some of that is just the nature of being a coastal community, and some of it is that a lot of these small businesses have not expanded enough to create the demand for the business services. So opportunities here going forward. All right, if we look at our traded sector index, this is one that we have some space on. So what is the traded sector? I think Jason explained it really well earlier when he said that these are businesses that are selling their products around the country and bringing in dollars to our community. So why is it important? Jobs in the traded sector tend to pay much better than jobs in the local sector. And that's often because of economies of scale. So it's really hard to scale up local services. I remember a friend one day when we were discussing pay, and he said, you know, people say work harder. It's really hard to mop a floor harder and get paid more. And that kind of stuck with me, right? So if we want to see pay increases, how do you get to the point where firms can afford to pay more? It's a story about scale, and it's hard to scale up services. Traded sector businesses tend to produce products and sell them around the country, which means as they get scale, they can realize returns on their designs or their production processes. We can work through the math of this if any of you all want to do some calculus, but think about it this way. The more a firm sells, the more profits there are to be paid to its workers. So these traded sector firms expanding in size leads to better pay in those industries in general. So examples of traded sector businesses: an automobile manufacturer is traded sector. They tend to be located in a handful of locations, sell their cars to the entire country, versus an automobile dealership tends to sell to the customers in the community in which it's located. So how do we do on this? This isn't our strong point. I think there are opportunities here. And when I say there are opportunities, this is where we need to think broadly about what those opportunities are. So when we have a conversation about the traded sector, we often automatically go to thinking about manufacturing. And there are many in this community that are, let's say, less than receptive to some manufacturers, right? And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we're going to move away from some of those traditionally thought of traded sector industries, what other industries are out there? So I thought, let's talk about it. So here are some of the conventionally thought of traded sector industries, right? These are your large manufacturers and your large employers in town. You automatically think about a Corning, a GE, Alchemy. You think about those. But there are a lot of other opportunities in this community as well that we don't necessarily associate with the traded sector. So examples such as Live Oak Bank, right? They're making loans around the country. They're providing their services around the country. Encino. There are lots of them that we don't think about as much. These are where the opportunities are. UNCW is on that list. Why? Well, one, we bring students in from around the country who spend their money here and go home. That's a lot like sending products to them. They just come pick them up from us over on South College Road. But the university's evolving. We're now sending products to our students with distance education. I'm getting ready to start an online class just after the first of the year, and none of my students are located in Wilmington. They're located all around the state. But when they pay tuition, it comes here. So this is just another example of, okay, how can we get more involved and grow this traded sector, thinking about areas that are outside of our first thoughts. All right, there's another one on here that I think is a great example, and that's civil works contracting. And you guys are like, who's that? We haven't heard that name. So if you look back through your Greater Wilmington Business Journal blast, there was one that came through with a headline about a construction company receiving approval to do NASA construction projects. That's traded sector. We have a tendency to think of, oh, well, construction is local. They build homes for folks that live in the community. But it doesn't have to be local. This is a great example of a company that, as they're growing, is now selling their services, their management outside of the region and bringing dollars into the region. And when they do that, guess who gets a raise? Traded sector brings the dollars in that turn in the income for our residents. So this last one is talking about quality of place. So as we were talking about the traded sector, I decided I would hold some of my comments until after you all discussed it, but I think it's worth briefly thinking about sort of the trends in economic development and the way communities approach it. So the first wave of economic development was a story about using incentives to chase footloose firms, trying to buy manufacturers and bring them to town. That has evolved over time to where the economic development community put an emphasis on supporting firms in the community, entrepreneurs and small business loan programs, and retaining the businesses we have, to now what's often referred to in the academic community as the third wave of economic development programs. And the third wave is where this is really a community effort and entrepreneurial support and incentives to attract firms are tactics of an overall strategy of setting the environment that facilitates economic growth. So this isn't a story about have Satterfield go out and shake some more hands and bring folks to town. He is a piece of the puzzle. All the rest of us are involved in this as well. So we want to think about this from a very broad perspective, which brings us to our last index, which is quality of place. How are we doing? So once again, there are always opportunities. We've talked about some opportunities and challenges this morning, but I think we should smile. This is a great town to live in. Go wander on the beach, well, I would say this evening. You may have missed your opportunity last night, might have been your last chance for that. But I couldn't help but think as I was on a bike ride last night in shorts in December on a quiet road at the beach, man, this is a great town. We've got a lot to be proud of. That being said, there are always opportunities, but overall, this is great. All right, so how do we score? The index reflects that. We do very, very well. We're doing better than our peers, and we're seeing improvements. What's driving the improvements? This is being driven largely by increases, well, is that the right term? Improvements in the crime rate. So as we look at some of these individual components, I should tell you that they're reverse coded, meaning we've taken the crime statistics and flipped them over such that a higher number is actually good so that it matches the rest of the statistics in the scorecard. The same thing with commute times, that's been reverse coded. Some of you who really enjoy podcasts might like a long commute. The rest of us prefer a shorter one. So if we look up here, we can see that on culture and recreational employment, we've lost a point or 2 points. I think that's probably just noise in the data. If anything, that might actually be a good sign. Remember that these are relative statistics, so that suggests that some folks have moved from those jobs into other jobs, which are potentially better paying. So I wouldn't put too much into that one. Healthcare access, we still score very, very well on. We've moved a little bit more towards the national average, but still have incredible healthcare access in terms of practitioners to population ratio. So I think we do very well there. And the big improvement is being driven by the good work done by our folks in the law enforcement community. When you see them, thank them. That's often a thankless job, but they've made big, big strides there. This has been good for our community. It's showing up in the data. So as I was grumbling on the way to work the other day about the length of my commute because there were 3 cars in front of me at one of the stoplights, I had to check myself and say, wait a minute, I get here pretty well every morning. Are there some problem intersections in town? Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's a lot to be optimistic about there as well. If you're reading the paper, you see that the improvements are in the pipeline and the planning phase, if not already in the construction phase. Think about the opening of the causeway to Brunswick County. That's going to make more and more folks from over there say, I live in Wilmington, not in Myrtle. So we do relatively well on commute times already. That's going to get better. One reason we do so well here is the unique geography of the area. So if you think about a traditional large city where you have an employment center downtown and everybody else drives out from there until they can afford property, that's very different than the way we're set up here. Here, our real estate markets revolve around water access. You drive along and you're like, why the heck is that little shack $1.5 million? And you find out that there's a creek behind it that at high tide you can float a canoe down. But it leads to some interesting real estate patterns, which has allowed us to have multiple employment nodes throughout town. So you have an employment center downtown. You have a growing employment center out at Mayfair. We see Midtown coming up, which means that there are opportunities for people to find property close to their employment and spend their times with their families and involved in the communities, not sitting in their car. You know, have some fun with numbers for a second. If you cut an hour off your commute each way, that's 2 hours a day, times 2,000 or 200 workdays a year. Think about how much vacation time is. That's like a free 8 weeks of vacation time. Living close to work and having short commute times allows us to be involved in this other stuff that we really want to spend our time on.
First, let's, again, look at the key takeaways. So again, the things that we mentioned before, and I'm not going to go through each one of them again, but just to highlight again the different areas and the things that come through the data this year. And then I'd turn your attention over to the Economic Development Outcomes page, which is page number 5 in there as well. And essentially, we talked a lot about the inputs. We see these in a couple different indicators. And these indicators are across both peer cities and the aspirational cities. And this is something to be proud of. We have a great community. As we talked about earlier, the average annual pay in the bottom right corner, essentially the one that stands out as our weakest area, evidenced by the technical and knowledge-based workforce shifts. So we've got an answer for that and why that's that way. Other areas, we look at things like the gross regional product per capita growth. And I think about my own business. You know, I'm in the financial planning investment world, and we've got a lot of retirees that are moving to this community, which are great for my business, not necessarily adding a lot to the workforce in that area. Per capita income growth as well. I was asking Dr. Jones why Raleigh was so much lower than us, and he made the comment, of course, when you're as big as Raleigh, it's hard to move the needle quite as much. So again, each one of these, we have something to be proud of. We're a very strong community. So with that, I want to thank you all, again, for your input today. And I'm going to turn it over to Mitch Lamb, who's the chairman of our Cape Fear Future Board.
Let's everyone give Adam and Jason a round of applause for the work they've done today. They started this process about a year ago, and they put a lot of hard work into this. So thank you, gentlemen, for putting this data together for us. As you've seen and heard here today, our region has some work to do. We've lost ground in human capital, and in particular, our number of knowledge workers. Although unemployment is low, many of the new jobs are positions within the service sector, which is on the lower end of the pay scale. The traded sector, which brings outside dollars in our community, has been flat. And our average pay growth has been anemic. So when you get back to your office, tell them Jason Wheeler says you need a raise. We said when we first published the scorecard 3 years ago that we wanted to start a dialogue. And today, we did our best to be proactive in starting that dialogue among all of you. And in getting your feedback today will help us identify ways we can move the needles. We also wanted the scorecard to be able to present unbiased data on where our region stands in relation to our peer cities that compete with us for jobs, economic investment, and our workforce. All are the things that are driving your businesses. With 3 scorecards under our belt, we're starting to see some trends. While a lot of what we discussed today isn't necessarily positive, but as Adam said, the sky's not necessarily falling either. And we can do better. And how we address these trends will determine what type of community Wilmington and our region continues to grow into. This isn't a challenge that can be addressed alone by the Wilmington Chamber of Commerce, Wilmington Business Development, Wilmington Downtown, Inc., the city or county governments, but it has to be addressed, and it must be addressed by all of us in this room and how we go about in our businesses. Let's do this in our own way by showing support for initiatives, taking an active interest in your community, attending public meetings, become a candidate for public office, volunteering on city and county boards, become involved with the chamber, become involved with other nonprofits. Continue to educate yourselves at events like this and at the RSM Economic Outlook in January. And lastly, everyone in this room has some influence in the community. Use that influence to make a change and move the needles. And in short, don't let the dialogue that we started here today end here. Thank you all for your support of the Chamber. Thank you all for your interest in your community and for being here today. And lastly, one housekeeping note, if you haven't gotten your parking voucher, make sure you get so before you leave here today. Thank you all again and have a happy holidays.